Good morning. How are we? Hopefully you guys feel more awake than I do right now. But I guess that's what coffee's for, even though it tastes terrible. Anyway, whoever picked those songs, that was a perfect intro for what we're going to talk about today. Obviously, we're in a series called My Messy Family, and today you will have no question what we're talking about with that name. Things get messy this week. We're in Genesis 21. If you would turn there, but maybe before you do, I want to pray and just open this up and give this to God. God, we just love you. We thank you so much for who you are. We thank you for your faithfulness despite the mess. We thank you that you are here right now, that you brought each of us here, and that you have something that you want to tell us. So open our ears to hear what you have to say, and just lead us where you want us to go. We love you, and we give this time to you. Amen. So we're in Genesis 21. If you have a Bible, please turn there. If you have a phone and you have the app, open it, click on it, whatever it is. If you don't have the app, you probably have time to download it. So you should do that. So no excuses, anyone. But Genesis 21. Before we start in Genesis 21, I want to give you a backstory. If you haven't been here the last few weeks, we've been following the life of Abraham. Very famous name, but you might not know much about his story. Abraham, his wife is Sarah. When they were 75, in chapter 12 of Genesis, we see that God called them out of the land that they had been living into a land called Canaan, which is like present-day Israel. So God called him when he was 75, and he basically made this promise to Abraham that I am going to make out of you, out of your children, out of Abraham and Sarah's children, a great nation. That nation is going to bless the world, and it's going to inherit the land that we know as Israel. So that was the promise that God gave Abraham at 75. But the catch was, Abraham was 75 years old, his wife was like 65 years old, and they didn't have a single kid. So like the promise that they would have a great nation coming out of their offspring was going to be a miracle, even at 75. Well, the time between Genesis 12 and Genesis 21 was 25 years. They've been waiting for God to give them a kid for 25 years. They still don't have one in this chapter that we're about to read, which is pretty crazy. And a lot has happened in that 25 years of waiting for Abraham and Sarah. And a lot of it is not good. For the last 25 years, if you've been with us the past few weeks, you've heard all these stories. But for those who haven't, and just as a way of reminder, since it'll be important context for today, there are a lot of stories of messes that Abraham and Sarah have made. Abraham has, at this point, lied twice about Sarah being his wife as he goes and visits other kings' nations because he thought, bad stuff will happen to me if they know that she's my wife because she's very beautiful, and so they're going to want to kill me to get to her or something. So he's lied twice about who Sarah actually was, and that's led to a lot of mess. But maybe the biggest one, and there are also other messes that Abraham's nephew Lot has gotten into. I'm not going to get into that today, but probably the biggest one was what happened 10 years after the original promise. So Abraham was 85 at that point. And Sarah said, this thing still isn't happening. We still don't have kids. The odds of us having kids are getting less and less likely. So we need to take things into our own hands. We need to make this happen because God's not coming through. And so he says, Abraham, why don't you go, take my servant Hagar, have a kid through her, and then the promise will come through that means. And so that happened. Hagar gets pregnant, and immediately Hagar starts to maybe look down, or at least Sarah perceives that Hagar's looking down on her because she was able to have a kid when Sarah wasn't. So things get real ugly. Sarah starts to treat her real badly. Hagar goes and flees into the wilderness. And God meets her in the wilderness and says, Hagar, you are going to have a son. I want you to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, because I've heard you, and I will provide. I will make him into a great nation. So go back to Sarah, serve Sarah, but I am providing for you. So that sort of started a lot of the mess. But God reiterated his promise to Abraham when he was 99 years old, so 14 years after Ishmael was born. He basically just echoed again that Ishmael is not the promised son. I said I would give Abraham and Sarah a son, so that's still coming, and that will happen a year from now. So when Abraham turns 100, you'll have a son. Sarah thought, this is ridiculous, I'm 90. 90-year-old women do not have kids. So she laughed and disbelieved what God had said. So that's what brings us to today. So that all that context, all that mess that happened is going to flood in and give context to the story we're going to look at. So if you're there, I think hopefully I gave you plenty of time. Genesis 21, verse 1. We'll read just a section of it, stop, and then go. It says, "The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, 'God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me.' And she said, 'Who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age.' And the child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on the day that Isaac was weaned." So right there, 25 years, I can't imagine how long that would seem, especially when you're already 75 years old. But we see right away that in the waiting, God was faithful. He was faithful. I think some people in this room probably aren't even 25 years old. But if you are, I want to ask you, where were you 25 years ago? Imagine God telling you something that was going to happen, you didn't know how long, and then just having to wait, like daily wait for that promise to be fulfilled. Those days would seem really long, right? But that's how God proves his faithfulness to us. And waiting is really hard. I was thinking about waiting. I don't know if you guys have been to Disneyland, but I really don't like Disneyland because to me it seems like a lot of hour and a half long waits. And even an hour and a half long wait, even though I know what's coming and I know it's coming eventually, I just don't like the process. I don't know that anyone likes the process of waiting. But those are small things, like waiting for a ride is one thing. Waiting for something that you hope to happen is another thing. And I imagine, I'm not preaching to the choir here, I don't know all of your stories, but I imagine a lot of your stories have involved waiting, or maybe you're in that right now. But there's tremendous hope that we see in this passage. Not only that God is faithful, but that God's plan brings tremendous joy. Sarah tried to manufacture God's plan, right? She tried 15 years earlier to make things happen on her own, and that didn't bring her joy. But this moment, you can see it in the way that she talks about her laughter, the fact she names her son Laughter. Isaac means laughter. So God took the laughter of disbelief from Sarah's story and is now turning it into a laughter of joy because she just can't believe how good God has been to her. So there is hope. I know it's hard, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we look through the rest of this passage. But there is hope. God is faithful. And God's plans for your life will be far sweeter than anything you can manufacture on your own. But sadly, like I said, they did try and manufacture it on their own, and they created quite a mess. But even in the mess, God is faithful, right? I think a lot of times we talk about it, I think it's one of our values, is that no one is disqualified from being used by God, and that's true here, right? Just because they had created a mess, and even a really big mess, God didn't disqualify them from the promise. He still followed through. He was still faithful, even in the mess. I think that's what grace is, right? We've all made messes. I could go on and on about all the messes I've made over the course of my life, but God has been faithful to follow through on the promises that he's given me despite the messes, and that's tremendous grace. But the messes don't just go away. Sin has consequences, and we see it in the next few verses. So let's read, we're starting in verse 9. It says, "But Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, laughing. So she said to Abraham, 'Cast out this slave woman with her son, For the son of the slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac. If you follow like the laughter, I think laughter is actually a really powerful like image that carries through this story. Remember, laughter was, Sarah laughed initially from disbelief, and then that laughter turned to joy. And now the new laughter is actually stealing the joy from her. And if you look at like Ishmael, this part of the story is basically just a reminder of the disbelief, disobedience, and sin that they had committed 15 years earlier. And that's what sin does. Sin is a thief that steals our joy. One of the greatest lies, I think, of the enemy is that your sin doesn't hurt anyone, but at a minimum, it hurts you. I could go and list a bunch of different types of sin. Some are not fun to talk about. Actually, none of them are fun to talk about. But every sin, if you look at the end result, it always leads to you losing joy. God's plan is always better. And I could list some of the ones that we commonly talk about in church, but actually, as I was thinking about it, the ones that I struggle with the most, I would say, are pride and envy. And those suck the joy out of my life. They literally like rip it from me. Because every time something good happens to you, I either want to prove that I'm better or I want what happened to you. And so I can't celebrate with you when I'm living in my own sin of pride and envy. And that is not the way that God intends for us to live. And that's just one example. So not only is it hurting me, but it's also hurting you because now I can't celebrate with you. And that's just like pride is devastating. Envy is devastating. Selfishness is devastating. I could go on and on about sexual sin and how it does that same thing. I could go on about any sin, and you can just see pretty easily, if you actually examine it, what it does to your own joy. And we see that here with Sarah. Immediately when the mockery comes, it's like a little reminder happened of like, oh yeah. And it's stealing and it's ripping the joy she should be feeling at this moment. And it's not just Sarah. Abraham is in a weird spot too, right? I mean, this isn't his first child. It was supposed to be. This was supposed to be a monumentous event, but it's not. He now is caught in between two kids that are sort of competing for this role of like the favorite child or the chosen child. And so he's in a really weird spot. And you see it in verse 11 when it says, "And the thing was very displeasing to Abraham on account of his son." Sarah wants to cast out Ishmael, and Abraham's like, no, but I love Ishmael. Like, why would I do that to my son? Because he's like 13 years old. So there's 13 years of love and history here. That's just heartbreaking. And maybe the next few verses are surprising, but let's read again in verse 12. It says, "But God said to Abraham, be not displeased because of the boy and because of your slave woman. Whatever Sarah says to you, do as she tells you. For through Isaac shall your offspring be named. And I will make a nation of the son of the slave woman also because he is your offspring." So Abraham rose early in the morning and took bread and a skin of water and gave it to Hagar, putting it on her shoulder, along with the child, and sent her away. And she departed and wandered in the wilderness of Beersheba. When Brian told me that I was going to be teaching this passage, I was not thrilled because 12 is really uncomfortable. It's basically God saying to Abraham, it's okay that you're about to send your son into the wilderness with no description of how he's going to survive. He doesn't give him a 10-step, here's exactly what I'm going to do. He just says, send your son in the wilderness, but I will provide. And I think that a lot of the times that's where we find ourselves, right? It's like we have the promises of God, but we have no idea how that's going to happen. So we have a choice. We either try and make our own way and do it our own way, or we trust what God says and follow through and just take a step. And I think we give Abraham maybe a hard time for all the mess that he made, but one amazing thing that he always does is he responds to God's commands quickly. In verse 14, it says, "So Abraham rose early in the morning." He obviously didn't like it. It said in 11 that he was displeased by the request Sarah had made, but he did it. He trusted and he knew, God, you provided a son for me when it, like, everything the world would say that wasn't possible, but you did it. And so I can trust that you're going to provide for Ishmael, even though I don't like how this is going. I don't like that I don't know, but I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it quickly. But let's transition a little bit to look. We talked about how sin steals our joy, but sin does a lot of other stuff. And I think if we transition and look at it from the perspective of Hagar and Ishmael, we see another thing that sin does. So if you think back, Hagar did not ask to be in this situation. Ishmael did not ask to be in this situation. They're sort of caught up in this like soap opera-y family. Like from the very beginning, they were kind of just, Hagar was thrust in and said, you're going to do this because we're going to try and make this happen through you. And then it got messy. She went into the wilderness, and then she's back. And now she's been part of this family for 13 years. And then sort of out of the blue, they say, okay, now you have to leave again. Like, what a mess. What dysfunction. And for me, it's really hard to like identify with Hagar in this. And I feel even blessed in saying that. But I know for some of us, it's probably not that hard to understand what she's feeling. Because maybe your family is full of dysfunction. Maybe you feel like Hagar. Maybe you feel like Ishmael. Maybe you feel like I don't have a home. Like I'm just this sort of thing that's there. And I feel like I'm cast out. I don't know how I'm going to provide. And that's a very real thing. And that's what sin does. Sin is an adversary which destroys our relationships. Like anytime, families are really easy to see this because of all the relationship dynamics, but it's not just families. Anytime you introduce sin into a relationship, it's going to eat away at it and destroy it. But there is hope. Thankfully, this isn't the end of the story. So let's keep reading in 15. It says, when the water in the skin was gone, she put the child under one of the bushes. Then she went and sat down opposite him a good way off, about the distance of a bow shot, for she said, let me not look on the death of the child. And as she sat opposite him, she lifted up her voice and wept. I know I just said it was going to get better, but this got really bad. I don't know, hopefully none of you have been in this situation, but I can't imagine, not even being able to be close to your son because you don't want to watch him die. I can't imagine a more desperate situation for a mom to be than sort of giving up and saying, we're going to die, and I'm just resolved that that's what's going to happen. But let's read in 17. It says, and God heard the voice of the boy, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what troubles you, Hagar? Fear not, for God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Up, lift up the boy and hold him fast with your hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Then God opened her eyes, and she saw a well of water, and she went and filled the skin with water and gave the boy a drink. And God was with the boy, and he grew up. He lived in the wilderness and became an expert with the bow. He lived in the wilderness of Paran, and his mother took a wife for him from the land of Egypt. So here we see, we saw the ramifications of sin, the consequences of sin, but here we see again that even in the wilderness, God is faithful. Even when you feel like there's nothing around you that looks promising, there's nothing that's providing for you, you're completely desperate, God will still be faithful then. And I think it's actually really cool how God speaks to Hagar in this. Bonus points, does anyone remember what Ishmael's name meant? It's okay, I said at the beginning, but Ishmael means God hears. That's what he told Ishmael the first time she was in the wilderness. This is now the second time that she's experiencing God's faithfulness and presence in the wilderness. But Ishmael means God hears. And in verse 17, it says, and God heard the voice of the boy. And then again it says, God has heard the voice of the boy where he is. Those were God's words to Hagar. It's almost like, and in Hebrew, this would actually read Ishmael. Like he's using the name that he gave her originally to say, I have heard you. Like I gave you a promise then that I was going to make Ishmael into a great nation. I have not forgotten that promise to you. Even when we forget, God doesn't forget the promises that he gives to us. And he doesn't forget. It's not like he's surprised by the hardship. He's always had a plan of providing. And I just think that's so cool, that God not only provides for Hagar, but he does it in a way where she will understand and remember, oh, you've been with me the whole time. It's also interesting in verse 19 when it says, then God opened her eyes and she saw a well of water. The well was there the whole time, which is really weird in this story, that like the well was there, but she's like resolved to die because she doesn't see it. And I think that's a lot of how God works in our lives too. Like God wants to be the provider. He is the provider, but he wants us to know that he's the provider. Because what he's most concerned with is our relationship with him. So even though the well was there the whole time, God did not let her see it until she saw God, and until she realized that God was the one that was providing. And I don't want to like venture to guess the reasoning behind why we have to go through hard things, but I think this is at least a reason, is that God wants us to know that it's him who's doing the work and not us. When things are really easy, it's easy to think, oh no, I did that. Like I made a way for myself. Whether it's, with a lot of the things that we tend to wait for, like marriage, kids, work, job, success, any of those things, when they come quick and easy, it's easy to credit yourself. But when they come hard and when the odds are completely stacked against you, that's when we clearly understand, no, God is the one that's been providing the whole time. He did this with Abraham and Sarah when they waited 25 years. Beyond all the odds, like, 90-year-olds don't have kids. 100-year-olds don't have kids. So God waited, and he made them wait until there was no other explanation for how it could have happened other than God did it. And that's what he does with Hagar. He makes her realize, or waits until she realizes, I have nothing on my own. Until he says, I am your provision. I will provide. And there are countless other examples. He did it with Gideon in the Bible, in Judges. It's kind of a fun story if you want to read it later. Basically, God says to Gideon, Gideon needs to go like fight this army, and he whittles down his army from 22,000 people to 300 because he keeps saying, and he does it like incrementally, just to say like, no, you still have too many. If you went and fought now and won, you'd still think it was you who did it. But I'm going to keep taking people from you so that when you do win, you'll understand it was me. But I think this story, it's easy to read this and be like, well, that was back then. God clearly gave them promises. What are the promises for me? Like, what has God said he would do for me? And there's a list I think we have. It may be broken up, but Abraham was under the Abrahamic covenant. We talked about the promises specifically given to Abraham. We talked about the promise specifically given to Hagar. This might be hard to read. You can come up if you want to take a picture. But I do recommend you do take pictures of this. These are the promises that God gives to you when you're following him. And there are a lot of them. Like I had to limit it to just a few, but there's a handful. And if one stands out to you, I recommend write it down. These are the things for you, and there are verses to go along with it. So if you want to see who's saying it, it's not me who's saying it. These are Jesus or one of the apostles. These are promises that God is giving to you. And even when you're in the wilderness, even when it feels desperate, this is what you can hold on to. Just like Hagar, he's saying, I already promised that I would do this for you. So just trust me. And the one cool other thing, too, as I draw this to a close, is how God talks to Hagar, I think, is really powerful for me. So I think it's really easy, whether you're waiting, whether you're in a desperate situation, it's really easy to think I'm alone. That, yeah, okay, these are these may be true, but not for me. Like, does God really see me? Does God really know my situation? Like, sure, God did this back in the day, but is he capable of actually following through, of actually being faithful to me? And I just love God's personalness with Hagar, because he says, I hear you. Like, I hear your voice right now. So to anyone who's like in a period of waiting, in a period of a wilderness, where you don't quite know what's going to happen, cling to these promises and remember God hears you. Ishmael, you. So with that said, I'd like to just invite Liz to come up and help us practice that. We're going to go into a period of just prayer. I just invite you, and Liz will have prompts, but I invite you, as you talk to God, just let him know. Cry out. Hagar cried out. It doesn't say she was eloquent. It doesn't say she was anything more than that. She just was very honest and said, I don't have anything left. So just cry out.